Planet Digital Foundry. Ambient temperature 1337 degrees. All videos nominal. Prepare for MechWarrior 2.
Everyone knows Activision these days, the publisher responsible for big franchises like Call of Duty, but there was a time when Activision was known more for its cutting-edge PC games. MechWarrior 2 is one of those games. It wasn't its first MechWarrior title, however. 1989 saw the release of the original MechWarrior. Developed by Dynamics and published by Activision, it features impressive EGA graphics capable of presenting a moderately detailed 3D world, at least for the time. It was well received, but the technology just wasn't yet there for a proper BattleTech experience. Getting from the original game to MechWarrior 2, however, was no small feat. MechWarrior 2 was originally subtitled The Clans and was targeting a release date in 1993. Amidst the departure of key staff members and numerous delays, MechWarrior 2 almost didn't make it. But in the end, the team managed to pull through and release the game on July 24th, 1995. At its core, MechWarrior 2 is a full 3D simulation of piloting a mech. Players can equip their mechs with all sorts of equipment, with only the weight limit determining what is possible or not. Once in the game then, players had to deal with objectives while grappling with relatively complex controls and elements such as heat management. The basic mission design follows a structure similar to many other space combat simulations of the day. Make your way to various nav points while dealing with hostile enemies along the way. Some missions ask players to assault and destroy enemy structures, while others put the player on defense. It was just complex enough to be interesting without requiring the dedication necessary to enjoy a hardcore flight simulation. The initial version of MechWarrior 2 was released exclusively for MS-DOS. For 1995, MechWarrior 2 was an extremely impressive looking game. The PC platform was only starting to become a viable place for complex full 3D graphics, and MechWarrior 2 was on the forefront. This original version runs primarily without textures, relying instead on flat shaded triangles and striking color gradients to build its world. Z-fighting was often a problem when objects were clumped together, but overall, the game has a very solid appearance and motion. The majority of the polygon budget was clearly spent on the mechs themselves though, and they did look quite good at the time. The mechs weren't simply detailed for cosmetic purposes though. It's possible to selectively destroy limbs, disabling the mechs in the process. This played a key role in the game design. MechWarrior 2 also offers a variety of resolution options. The game defaults to the expected 320 by 200, but it was also possible to select 640 by 480 or the almost unheard of 1024 by 768. This was impressive not just because it was an incredibly high resolution for 1995, but also because the game itself was already cutting edge visually. There weren't many PCs from that era that could actually play the game at this quality, mind you, but it sure did help future-proof the game as it still looks remarkably crisp and clean today. Another key element to its presentation is the soundtrack. This was still the era of CD-ROM and multimedia, and a Red Book soundtrack was still a big deal. Many PC games from this era relied on MIDI music, which left your average PC user stuck with FM synthesis, unless you owned a Wavetable sound card or an external general MIDI device like the Roland SC55. More importantly, the actual tracks themselves were extremely memorable. Then we have the pre-rendered intro cinematics, which I have to mention here. Not only was the content itself extremely well made, but seeing full-screen video playback of this quality running from a 2x CD-ROM drive was really quite impressive for its day. It's easy to take things like video sequences and high-quality music for granted, but these elements were technically impressive at the time and helped define the game that we remember. Of course, part of the reason the game is remembered by so many ties into the fact that it was released for years. If you look at all three MechWarrior 2 games, there are 38 separate versions available. This includes special promotional releases of course, but it's an impressive number nonetheless. There are two reasons for this, I'd say. the 3D accelerator boom that was just starting to take place in 1995, and the migration to Windows 95 for gaming. On the 3D side, just about every major vendor had a version of MechWarrior 2 available. This was the Wild West of 3D gaming after all, where developers needed to individually support each vendor's card separately. We're looking at the 3DFX Voodoo version of the game here, but it was also made available for cards like the ATI Rage 3D series, PowerVR, the S3 Verge 3D Decelerator, and the Matrox Mystique, a card which I actually still own from that era. When acceleration is enabled, the entire game world becomes fully textured. A new sky system is built here to enable fast-moving clouds, which does look pretty cool, and the game takes on a new sense of solidarity that was previously lacking. But the 3D version has some limitations. For one thing, the maximum resolution is now reduced. 3D cards of this era simply didn't have enough memory to handle higher resolutions. The Voodoo 1, for instance, shipped with 4 megabytes of memory in its most common configuration, and only supported 2 resolutions, 512 by 384 and 640 by 480. None of these cards could support 3D rendering at 1024 by 768 just yet. That would be reserved for the likes of the Voodoo 2 in SLI mode. Over time, I've found that I actually now prefer the flat-shaded original look of the game. The color schemes were much more carefully considered there and often more dramatic. The blood orange sunset of the introductory mission of the original gives way to a much less dramatic scene when played on 3DFX. The look of the game also recalls the otherworldly design of something like Another World. The 3D accelerated version in comparison just looks kinda dated. There are even missions in the original which use the color palette to shift the time of day during the mission, which is absent in the 3D accelerated version. The mechs themselves also received additional geometry in the 3D accelerated version. The 3DFX version, however, actually features fewer textures in the original game for some reason, but versions for other 3D cards, such as the PowerVR version, did actually include additional textures here. Then of course we come to the Windows 95 port of the game, and there were several of these. The one here that we're looking at is actually the Battle Pack version. While fully rendered in software, this version now supports terrain textures and offers improved mech rendering complete with shadows. It does look relatively nice overall, but the color scheme is still rather dull here and lacks the dramatic settings of the original game. This version is also missing many of the music tracks, and in fact the final track on the disc is actually corrupt. It doesn't play properly at all. Also, when you pause and unpause the various Windows versions of the game, including the 3DFX version, it actually resets the CD audio to the wrong track in many missions, which is not an issue in DOS, and it does lead to the sense that the game isn't quite as polished in its Windows version. It's fascinating to stack all 3 versions up against one another, however. Each one looks completely different from the last, and they all have different quirks in terms of gameplay. As I suggested above, I've grown to prefer the flat-shaded appearance of the original game with its more interesting color schemes and support for higher resolutions, but I'm also interested to know what you guys think about it. Which one do you prefer? One of the last versions released then was the Titanium Trilogy, which included MechWarrior 2, Ghost Bear Legacy, and Mercenaries. This version included Direct 3D support and introduced a new set of textures once again. It's pretty remarkable how often the game has been redesigned, although this version actually does not include the higher polygon meshes used in the other 3D accelerated versions. Go figure. But in the end, every version of MechWarrior 2 is basically derived from one of these 4 versions. You have the original flat-shaded DOS game, the textured Windows 95 release, the original 3D accelerated version in all its iterations, and then the Titanium Trilogy. While all of these versions were released on the PC though, there was actually a console version of MechWarrior 2 as well, this time for the Saturn and the PlayStation. Unfortunately, the game itself shares almost nothing with the PC original, but it's still reasonably fun. It's basically an arcade version of MechWarrior 2 with simplified controls. Many of the game's missions actually stem from the original game in terms of what you need to destroy or defend, but the maps themselves are smaller and less complicated overall. The game has a look similar to the 3D accelerated version of the game on PC, but somehow manages to look somewhat nicer despite the lower resolution, I think. Impressively, the game also happens to look better on Sega Saturn. The textures appear far less warped than on the PlayStation, while the cloud scrolling is smoother. The only downside though is that transparency effects like explosions use the mesh pattern instead of the half transparency we see on PlayStation. On the flip side, the maps themselves actually vary slightly in each version. This wall here in the PlayStation version, for instance, hiding the objective, it's actually completely missing on the Sega Saturn. Strange. Oh, and the soundtrack in this version is actually ripped straight from MechWarrior 2 Mercenaries rather than the original game. But ultimately, this version of MechWarrior 2 is really just kind of a sideshow. It's an interesting footnote from when console and PC games were as different as could be. If you really want to go back and play MechWarrior 2 today though, I recommend the PC original. The DOS version runs like a dream in DOSBox and supports 1024x768, and it's relatively easy to configure. Check out the link in the description below for an idea of how to set the game up. There are a lot of people out there still trying to keep this game alive. It's also possible to use something called mechvm to run the various Windows versions of the game. But unfortunately, this really didn't work very well in Windows 10. Every single game crashed on my PC, and I had to use an older Pentium 4 PC with Windows XP in order to capture footage of the game. However you choose to play the game, however, I do recommend giving it a shot. But with that, we've reached the end of another episode. If you enjoyed this one on MechWarrior 2, be sure to let me know, and maybe sometime in the future we'll actually take a look at MechWarrior 2 Mercenaries, and maybe I'll even be able to get my hands on some of the other various 3D accelerator cards out there. But if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to give us a like and subscribe as always, and until next time, stay retro. On the next episode of DF Retro.